presentation as well. And I think that those are the logistical details. The chat, for those of you who are not familiar, is in the bottom panel bar of your Zoom, and you can ask us questions. And so without further ado, we'll get going. And what I'd like to do is start just telling you the overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to discuss some general principles. We're going to discuss Governor Hogan's roadmap to recovery and what that looks like, because that's really going to be the foundation for what we're allowed to do as businesses seeking to reopen, shift back from a telework paradigm, or maybe stay that way and figure out what our new normal is. A quick disclaimer, and if you've been on these webinars over the last month, you're probably quite familiar at this point. What Randy and I are discussing today is not legal advice. It's for informational purposes only. If you have specific questions beyond the hypothetical situations we're discussing today, please give us a call, contact your counsel, whether that's someone here or elsewhere, in order to get guidance on how to proceed. So a week ago today, so on April 24th, Governor Hogan released his Maryland Strong Road Back to Recovery plan, which set forth a number of steps, 3 phases for Maryland to reopen and reintegrate their workplaces. One of the reasons, the impetus for the governor doing that was that we have hopefully successfully flattened the curve. The daily deaths appear to have peaked. There certainly could be spikes in the future. And we flattened the curve when it comes to total beds in use in healthcare facilities, whether that's acute or ICU. So that is all good, and the trajectory is going quite well. And Governor Hogan's plan is based on 4, or what they call building blocks: expanded testing capacity, increased hospital surge capacity, ramping up the supply of PPE, personal protective equipment, as well as robust contact tracing. And I was just reading yesterday that the FDA has approved, gone through the approval process for the tests that the state of Maryland has acquired from South Korea. So hopefully those will be able to be put into play sooner rather than later. Now, we aren't where other states are in terms of reopening. We're not even in stage 1 yet. We're still in a very restrictive phase, and there's no hard and fast calendar or deadline or projected date by which we're going to start going through phase 1, 2, and 3. But again, we should start planning now. 3 primary considerations Governor Hogan and his advisors have said as we begin to reopen and reintegrate are: you should plan on continuing to telework for the foreseeable future. That's got to be part of how you are going to operate your business moving forward. Whether it's 100% telework or partial telework, that scale is not shifting yet. The state also wants us to continue wearing masks when we're interacting with others. The masks that you wear protect others, and the masks that others wear protect you. And so that's what they tell us. And they also are putting a focus on aggressive social distancing, physical distancing, for what they say, quote, a little while longer. I suspect they're going to be pushing that for a while longer, but we shall see. And these things, those 3 things, the masks, the social distancing, and the teleworking, are important to progress through all the various phases of Governor Hogan's plan, which include stage 1, which would lift the current order, the stay-at-home order that's in effect, reopening certain businesses, permitting more curbside pickup and drop-off compared to what is currently in play, more outdoor activities, and if your car is filthy, reopening car washes, which might be good. Although I will say, for a mental health perspective, I thoroughly enjoyed getting our cars out into the driveway with my little children and hosing them down. It's good activity to get outside and do something different.
Hosing your kids or the cars? Which one was it?
Both. So that's phase one for the governor's plan, as we have a couple more folks joining us. Stage two, again, we don't have any date certain on when this will occur, is larger gatherings, indoor and outdoor, reopening higher capacity bars and restaurants, again, while maintaining the social distancing, permitting family visits to nursing homes. So things that will allow us to integrate back into the way of life that we were formerly used to. What we only get from stage one to stage two and stage two to stage three if the warning signs and the trends continue in terms of hospital beds in use and infection rates. And so as we go through this process, if there's a spike, we might have to hit pause or take a step back. The state has also said that various geographic areas are going to be permitted to pursue their own or slightly faster or slightly slower approaches based on the numbers in those regions, based on hospital beds and infection rates. So there's not a one-size-fits-all for the state of Maryland. There's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all for each county. And really the important takeaway, one of the important takeaways from our talk today is there's no one-size-fits-all for businesses, because we've all gotten to a certain place, whether we've had to implement layoffs or the capacity for teleworking, our economic and financial condition. So we have to take all of those things into consideration as we're putting forth our plan to get back to work. And I realize I just touched my face. Don't judge me for that. It's a habit that I need to get over, I guess, if I'm to follow the advice of the government. So that's kind of the overview. That's Governor Hogan's plan. As I mentioned, we're not on the eve of this. I suppose end of May is when they could start implementing stage one, but we don't know yet. There are 13 industry-specific advisory groups that are providing guidance to the government on what to do in particular industries, and we're going to wait for the report and recommendations from those groups to be able to pass along what the state is telling us. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Randy, who's going to talk about some general principles that we need to keep in mind, and we'll go through some important considerations before we start taking your questions. So thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Garrett. Good morning, everyone. So, our hope today is that we can get the conversation really started with you all, that you can take back to your workplaces so that you can start meaningfully thinking and planning and implementing what reopening and reintegrating your workforce is going to look like. And there are obviously a host of practical, logistical, and legal considerations that you're going to need to evaluate and consider as you think about what it is going to mean for you to reopen your workplace, bring employees back, start transitioning, if possible, from telework to in-place work and other items. So essentially, the way we're going to talk about this over the next 20-30 minutes is give you sort of general principles to consider with your reintegration, reopening plan, talk about specific consideration and planning, focus on workplace safety, employer policies, as well as accommodation issues. So I want to give you just sort of that general outline so you can think about those as a guidepost that we'll be talking about in varying levels of detail as we go through this. There isn't a PowerPoint to go along with this, as Garrett and I and our other partners at the firm and attorneys were talking about how to do this. We really just wanted to make this conversational and really talk through what we think is a good strategy to consider and details that you'll need to think about. Certainly have paper, pen with you to take notes, and we're always happy to answer questions. So I think the theme and the key words that all employers need to keep in mind as they're talking about reintegration and planning reintegration and reopening is being flexible, being creative, and being responsive. Because this is and has been, as we've all experienced, a very evolving, fluid, day-to-day, sometimes hour-to-hour change in what is and isn't permissible, what is and isn't realistic. So that is going to not only need to continue, but probably be elevated even more so as we get more guidance from the government, the CDC, Governor Hogan's office, perhaps the federal government on how reopening the workforce is going to look like. But let's get into those general principles. So as a guide, overarching guidepost to think about when you're actually saying, okay, how are we going to reintegrate our workforce? How are we going to reopen it? Well, you need to have these decisions made by a team. Team doesn't need to be large. The team can be small. It's obviously going to depend on the size of your company, but you want to have different points of views considered. You want to have somebody who is sort of in charge of the team, identifying team members so that you can then create together the plan that will in fact unfold for your company to reopen and reintegrate. You're going to want to be able to identify what those reasons are for returning employees to work. Employees are going to need to understand who was and who wasn't selected. And once we sort of talk about that more specifically, it may very well be that you are not going to be able to either all at once or even over time bring your entire workforce back if you have implemented layoffs or furloughs or had to do any kind of terminations. So you're going to want to be able to articulate and expect that in the future, you are going to have to explain and defend certain employment decisions that you made. So with that in mind, and as employment lawyers, we're certainly, always thinking about that. You're going to want to make sure that you have clear and understandable and explainable reasons for the decisions that you've made. How many employees and what sort of category of employees are going to return first? Again, it may be that returning employees to work is going to need to happen in phases, and that there are certain departments or operations or functions that warrant bringing employees back faster and sooner and in higher numbers. So you're going to have to identify if this is going to be reintroduction in stages, identify what positions within those stages are going to need to be included now, maybe short term and long term. And you're always going to want to make sure that you are, as you are creating these lists of positions within departments and looking at the employees that correlate with the positions, are there any adverse impact or sort of discriminatory impact on certain protected groups or classes as a result of these business decisions to bring folks back? It doesn't necessarily mean you need to change your strategy, but you certainly want to be aware of whether a disproportionate number of minorities are left out, if you will, of the reintegration plan, whether completely or in the beginning of the process, so that you understand if there are risks and reassessments that need to happen.
Randy, I don't mean, I'm sorry, don't mean to interrupt you, but we got a question, and I should have said this at the beginning. And Randy mentioned take notes because there's not a PowerPoint accompanying our chat today, but we have prepared a checklist that covers all of the topical issues with some detail that we're addressing today. And so if you're interested in that, contact Randy or me or the attorney that you're familiar with at Coleman and Saucier, and we're happy to provide that with you, and also to then tailor and right size it to fit your organization, because as we've both mentioned, one size is not going to fit everyone. So I just wanted to make that point, and I'm sorry for interrupting you, Randy.
Oh, no, not at all. And right, as questions come in, Garrett is in charge of sort of monitoring the questions. And we will address them either in real time as they come in, if it makes sense based on what we're talking about at the moment, or if we need to defer answering once we've sort of gotten through particular content, we'll circle back. But absolutely. So in addition to the positions, you also are going to need to think about generally, are there going to be altered schedules? Are you going to have shortened days perhaps, or have employees coming back fewer days of the week? You're going to want to think about what that looks like again, how that might be, whether it's going to be for a period of time as best you can identify. Certainly, of course, there may be wage and hour issues that you need to evaluate as well, based on the number of hours employees may be working. If you have employees that are classified as exempt, whether there's going to be any adjustments to their salaries because they're going to be working much less for a period of time. If you are going to reduce what their salary is, you certainly, for example, need to make sure it still complies with the minimum weekly required amount. And in the state of Maryland, if you give any reduction in pay to employees, you need to give at least a full pay period's notice. So there might be things like that, if you haven't already had to face those issues, that you need to be aware of and consult as necessary with, your internal folks, and certainly with legal advice counsel to help you with that. Absolutely paramount, and Garrett and I are going to be talking more in depth about this a little bit further along this morning's presentation, is having very clear safety guidelines in place. So I'm not going to get into the brass tacks of that right at this moment, but absolutely flag that as part of a reintegration and return to work. I imagine, and we know from the calls and the emails that we have all been taking over the last 4 to 6 weeks with our clients, that there's already been a very appropriate and responsive focus on safety and workplace safety and health and all that comes up with COVID. That's going to be even more so when you are now adding a lot more bodies, both as far as your workforce and perhaps visitors and vendors and other people that may be coming into your facility. So having a very robust safety program that is, of course, in compliance with CDC guidelines. I think the biggest, one of the biggest keys to really implementing well and doing right by your workforce is having a very regular, transparent, and clear communication plan in place. And by that, I mean, you want your employees to know exactly what it is you are doing as far as the reopening and reintegration, what that looks like, what that's going to mean for either the staggered start, changes in schedules, the anticipated dates and timelines that workers can expect to come back, who it is that employees can reach out to with questions. Typically, we've been talking with clients and they usually have a designated person or two. And again, it's going to depend on the size of your company and, the number of shifts and workers and locations. And obviously everything is going to be very employer specific, but making sure employees know who they can talk to, who they can reach out to, where they can go with any questions related to coming back to work and what that's going to mean and look like for them. We absolutely recommend very regular, robust communication to employees, whether that is accomplished by, a very well-written, regularly sent email that is disseminated to the workforce. If you have a website and the technology to post on your website, sort of a COVID-19 center that those are certainly on nearly every website you visit. You can't help but see a COVID-19 center. So certainly, if your technology permits that, making it clear to employees what you're doing for safety, what you're doing for a return to work, how you all are responding and managing and intending to proceed with getting back to whatever our new normal is going to look like. And certainly as updates happen and as things unfold and as we do hopefully get closer to the ability to actually implement what we're talking about, making sure employees are informed, feel heard, and giving them the opportunity to ask questions.
Randy, on that point, we got a question from Cynthia regarding sending out whether it's a good idea, and if so, some examples of questions that employers can send to employees to proactively obtain feedback. My initial thoughts on that are you as the employer and the team that you put together should certainly be the decision maker. But as you want, in addition to reaching out with information to employees, find out how teleworking is working. Find out what are the concerns employees might have for returning to work so that you'll have that information to inform your decision making. Maybe the feedback you get from your employees will allow you to telework longer if that's appropriate for your organization. Or maybe you'll get information that will allow you to make modifications at the workplace that will ease the transition back into the physical facility or location. You could also get information on, when you're ready to return to work, who might voluntarily return to work, so that you're helping separate those who it's harder to return to the physical location because of a child care or school closure situation. And that information is going to be very useful for planning purposes. I don't know, Randy, if you have additional thoughts on that.
No, I think that those are helpful. Again, I think communication is key, and right, asking employees sort of where they are, and that's going to also require, I mean, what are, as you're thinking about what your needs are, and a big issue that is going to come up, and I don't think I have a day that goes by that I don't have a conversation with a client about this, is so many of us have, even us that are essential, have been able to and have figured out how to telework. And I think we all have to recognize, and I think probably have, whether we've said it out loud, that teleworking and remote working, offsite working, sort of alternative, flexible working, using Zoom, Teams, and all the other platforms that have become sort of part of the common vernacular over the last month or so, is not going to go away simply because there is going to be a point in time in the future where technically employees are going to be allowed to return to work if they are otherwise able, right, because they don't have childcare or family care or other obligations at home because schools may still be closed or whatever. And how is telework going to be something that you will or will not be able to continue and permit, sort of outside of, the ADA accommodations aspect, but just, how has teleworking worked for you? Are there certain positions that actually, now that we've had to live through this for as long as we have, we've decided we can actually maybe continue to function this way, even if it's on a partial telework basis, or, sort of an extended, we'll see if how much longer we can do this. So I think those are going to be absolutely appropriate things to discuss, not only with your decision-making team, but with the workforce as well. But we also may find that once, and this is again as part of that being flexible and responsive, once more employees are back in the workplace, and once other businesses and sort of everybody kind of starts to return and resume to a bit more of what the new normal will be, it may be that teleworking isn't as appropriate or as productive as what once was, when more people were involved in teleworking. And I think there's going to be that as well. So getting back and finishing up a couple of these overriding guidelines, you may also decide that you were actually going to have employees that you're just going to have to keep, either if you haven't terminated them already, that you will in fact either terminate or that the employment will end. And, making an employment decision or a business decision as to whether you're going to challenge any sort of claims for unemployment. I think right now that any challenges are absent there being significant documentation of pre-existing performance or behavioral issues, I can't imagine that there's going to be much sort of opportunity for meaningful challenge to unemployment, but that's still something, a box that you'd want to check. And above all else, and something that goes without saying, but I'm going to say it because, we're employment lawyers, and we love and need documentation, and you as employers absolutely want to make sure that all efforts that you are making to reintegrate the workforce, and the decisions that you're going to be making as to bringing employees back into the workforce, and how those decisions were made and what the factors were, you're going to want to make sure that you have appropriate documentation for that. Garrett, anything to add on that?
Not on the guidelines. I thought you covered them quite well. I suppose the one other addition that I would make is keep in mind whether you've already considered or implemented layoffs, or you might be making layoff decisions. All of that is part and parcel to the planning that we're talking about now, because of the notice requirements. And as we get further into the COVID-19 situation, certain exceptions to notice requirements are going to go away, because what the impact on our businesses is going to become more foreseeable. So do this planning now, have these conversations now, and figure out what it is you need to do. Give yourself options so that you can proceed with the flexibility Randy discussed.
Great. Right. A couple more thoughts that I want to share, a little bit deeper dive on sort of the consideration and planning aspect. And then Garrett and I are going to get into talking about sort of safety and policies and accommodations. But again, we're creating this plan, we're developing the timing and the scope about when we think we're going to be able to reopen, or whatever it means for your company to return to sort of a new state of functioning post being able to reintegrate people. The financial component, which maybe hasn't been directly identified, but is certainly an undercurrent in all of this, and that I will say right now as a direct detail, you absolutely, and I'm sure you all have already had your people and have been doing this, what is the financial health of your organization right now? What can you financially withstand? What are your budget priorities? Those, the tax credits, the loans, and the PPP programs and everything that's out there right now are all going to be huge factors, and of course, in what decisions you make. And again, you're going to want to make sure that you have thought about and in fact document how the financial health of your organization is impacting, to the extent that can be evaluated and actually reduced into writing, and how that is impacting the decisions that you make. Those employees that you have furloughed or laid off or have conducted some kind of reduction in force, who are going to be the decision makers as to who comes back and in what order, and what are going to be the determining factors as to who comes back and in what order, and making sure that that sort of re-entry into the workplace is done as cleanly and as consistently with either pre-existing policies or pre-existing policies that appropriately have been or need to be modified for this very unique pandemic situation. One thing that I want to say right now on this that has come up certainly in other times when employers have had to, for a variety of reasons, implement furloughs or reductions in force, and then when it's time to bring employees back, they use this situation, I'm just going to put it out there, and because I understand the realities, as an opportunity to get rid of problem employees that maybe have not been properly managed in sort of pre-COVID times, because managers don't always have the opportunity to document issues, or they're not written up when they should be, or for whatever the reasons. And this is somebody who it's just, oh, this is a great excuse or opportunity to get rid of that employee and not bring him or her back. Understand, and I'm sure you all probably appreciate this, when it's time for jobs to sort of start back up again and people are getting rehired, those people that are not rehired are going to have nothing but time on their hands and the ability to file whatever challenges and charges and lawsuits and other claims that they have, because they feel that they were wrongly not brought back when they see any other number of employees that were. So you have to expect and plan that you are absolutely at some point in time going to need to explain and defend the decisions that you made. So for every employee, you're going to want to make sure that you feel as comfortable as you can, and that the documentation and that the objective decision-making process justifies why certain employees maybe were not brought back, particularly those that you may not have good documentation for otherwise if the issues are performance-based. So just keep that in mind. And then, as Garrett sort of referenced earlier, there may be certain classes of employees that just can't come back even though they want to, because they either still have children who don't have daycare or school. They may have people at home that they're taking care of. They may have an underlying health issue that makes them more at risk and still under a doctor's order that it wouldn't be safe to return to work. So you need to, and again, every situation is going to be unique. So neither Garrett nor I or anybody that you might regularly speak with can give you the answer right here and now as to what you do, because every person's going to need to be evaluated uniquely, and every situation is certainly going to need to be evaluated on the merits of what that person's position is and what their restrictions are and what may or may not be feasible as an accommodation. But you need to at least anticipate that those requests are going to happen, that there are going to be employees who cannot come back to work for any number of legitimate reasons, and how it is that you're going to be able to respond to that.
Randy, we got a couple of questions on that topic that you just addressed.
Okay, great.
Specifically with respect to individuals who might have an underlying condition, or for one reason or another might be at higher risk based on CDC guidance, and what employers should do with respect to getting those folks back into the physical workplace if teleworking is an option. And this specific question was whether an employer can require the employee to work from home. And the answer to, as Randy just addressed, is you're going to make an individualized decision. You're going to have a conversation with the employee it's akin to the ADA interactive process to determine what is going to work for that employee and the employer, and come up with the accommodation that works. But what you don't want to do is discriminate against someone, whether it's a pregnant individual or someone with an underlying medical condition or someone of a certain age, based simply on that characteristic. That would expose you to significant risk, and you don't want to do that. Randy, anything different or otherwise on that point?
Was the question, can you, if somebody can't come back to work for, we'll just call it a legitimate reason, can you require that they telework? Was that the question?
The question was, you have a high risk employee and you don't want that employee back in the physical workspace.
Right.
How should you address that employee? That employee has not come to you, but you are aware of the underlying demographic or condition.
Right. Well, I don't know. I mean, again, with the typical lawyer caveat, it depends, and we need to, really get into the particulars of the situation. But if the employee is willing to come back to work and you're able to implement and provide, as we're going to be talking about, we're going to be shifting gears in a moment and getting into the safe workplace and steps that need to be taken and will be taken to keep the workplace safe. If we can keep the employee relatively safe, and provide him or her with, the means to keep themselves safe and social distancing and all the things, and they're not exhibiting symptoms or around people that are exhibiting symptoms, I don't know that we as the employer can play sort of doctor or parent, if you will, and mandate that the employee stay out of the workplace. We can certainly offer it to them and encourage it, but I think I'm a little uncomfortable about the idea of mandating it, because I don't know that almost, while I understand it's well-intentioned, I don't know that it would make sense in the scheme of things to require an employee, absent there being a doctor's order that says you must work from home. If work from home is possible, then certainly yes. But if you don't have that, I think it would need to be much more, as you were just saying, Garrett, of that interactive process and discussing it as an option. And then if the employee doesn't want that option and they want to return to the physical workspace, figuring out, how to safely do that. So with that, let's transition, and I'll sort of kick it back to you, Garrett, to sort of lead us off on the conversation of workplace safety and sort of what maybe you've already been doing, if you have employees in the workplace, and then what you certainly are going to need and want to do as we gear up for that. And one thought that I just want to share before I actually do turn it back over is, one thing, and this is sort of a random detail that popped into my head as we were this morning, preparing for this. While we're still in this sort of holding pattern, I remember when this first started, I mean, you could not walk into a store, grocery store, Target, Walgreens, wherever you do sort of your shopping for non-perishables, and find hand sanitizer, cleansing, cleaning equipment, paper towels, all those things. I mean, it was impossible to find them. My guess is once the return to work happens, I don't know what shortages and supplies are, but once you identify the supplies that you are going to want and need to have in the workplace for cleaning and sanitation and PPE and all that, now is probably the time to make those orders and figure that out, or sooner than later, so that you can get ahead of maybe the mass purchases that are going to happen and the shortages that we may see again. So with that, Garrett.
Yeah, absolutely, Randy, because one of the guidance from the CDC and the state and OSHA is to have those hygiene products in place and on hand when you return to your facility. So what you do if there's still a shortage, you get in the queue so that you'll have them ready when you're ready to reopen. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to breeze through, go a little bit more quickly through some workplace screening concepts and tips that we need to keep in mind, because you're asking some really good questions. And while I think I'm a fairly good multitasker, talking and reading the questions in the chat is challenging. So if you, just as a request, when you're asking questions, try not to write 5, 6 sentence questions. If you could keep them to a line or two, that would make getting through them and addressing folks' questions more efficient. And so let me get to this, and we'll get to the Q&A part. Things that you want to keep in mind here are you going to pre-screen employees when you're returning to work. For the time being, COVID-19 is what is called a direct threat. And so taking the temperature, screening your employees before they enter the workplace is allowed. you want to be sure to do that in a non-discriminatory manner, so you're going to treat your employees consistently. You also need to consider whether you're going to require anybody entering your facility to be screened. And so there are safety considerations there, as well as are you going to really subject the delivery man and a customer to these requirements? And you can make a pro and con list for both, but safety is, of course, paramount as well. So keep that in mind. You're also going to want to consider how often you're going to do monitoring, whether it's going to be daily, weekly, or when symptoms arise. The state has advised that employers should check the temperature of all individuals entering the workplace. But again, you can make a convincing argument to me on why that may not necessarily make sense. You don't want to ask about underlying health conditions. What you want to ask about is symptoms, particularly of the employee, so that you don't get too far afield and ask questions that will get you into trouble under privacy laws and ADA laws, the ADA rather. You're going to want to educate employees. I'm not a doctor. Randy's not a doctor, and neither of us stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night. However, what you can do is go to the CDC, go to OSHA. These websites have terrific information. And in that checklist I mentioned earlier, we've linked to this information so that go to the source. They've got very handy printable posters that you can use to educate your employees. OSHA in particular, you can go and identify your industry, find out what OSHA says your risk assessment level is, and when you're in your particular industry, low risk, when you're medium risk, when you're high risk. And it's a very useful guide. I had not spent a lot of time on the OSHA website, and I found it extremely informative, and I think you would do the same. And one of the reasons that's important is as the Secretary of Labor made clear yesterday, they're on the case. I think he said the cops are on the beat, was the direct quote, because the U.S. Department of Labor is getting a lot of pushback for not implementing specific regulations and standards with respect to COVID-19. And the response is, no, we are taking our job seriously. We're out there making sure that folks are social distancing, using PPE where required, masks, and having proper safety procedures in place. And that includes where you are required to have PPE, you are training employees on proper use. Because one of the problems, which you might have read if you picked up the Post or the New York Times or the Baltimore Sun recently, is you have a significant risk of exposure in taking off a mask, for example, if you don't do it properly. So we have to be aware of that. We don't want to assume that we have armor because we're wearing a mask or using other protective equipment and think we are insulated from exposure. Proper technique is going to be important. The symptoms that we're supposed to monitor include the fever, chills. The list that the CDC has identified was recently expanded to include muscle aches and shivers and things of that nature. So we'll continue to monitor the CDC website on the symptoms of COVID-19 as we learn more about the virus. So that's important to keep in mind as well. Sore throat is another one that was recently identified or added to the symptoms list.
And loss of smell and taste, I think, also is one of those unique characteristics too. Yeah.
And then if you have an employee who was diagnosed, you're going to wait out the 14 days before that individual returns to work. You're going to do your own contact tracing to figure out what other exposure there might have been. We don't want you to identify the individual, but you should identify that there was potential exposure. And so that's the distinction you want to draw there. And doing this the right way, to kind of reiterate some points Randy made, can help mitigate against wage and hour concerns. So when you're in the teleworking land, you're keeping track of what hours were worked and when, so that you're paying your employees properly. For those who have been diagnosed or for caring for a child, you have the leave law risk, especially under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and then the risk from OSHA coming in and finding a violation. And then as well, whether or not you're going to make employment decisions, whether it's layoffs or how you're going to stagger your reintegration, all of that comes into play when you're trying to mitigate the risk. I think the last points I want to hit on the safety and screening component before we revert to the questions. Keep in mind that this is not reopening and going back to things as they were. I know that sounds obvious, but you're going to have new guidelines in place. That might mean, to the extent possible, shifting around the physical location of desks so that it can be social distancing where proper in the workplace. Figure out how common areas are going to be used, whether there will be maximum capacity in the kitchen or where the water fountains are, so that you are complying with the state's guidance. Consider as well how frequently you're going to clean and what you're going to use to clean. And then, just as you have to train employees on use of PPE, you want folks to understand the proper way to use cleaning supplies as well, so they're not mixing ingredients that should not be mixed. Randy, anything to add at this point?
Just a couple of quick comments. As far as the screening of employees, and we've made clear with posts we put out on our blog, and there's plenty of other law firms doing the same and educating all of us on what's going on. We get to and should in fact ask the inquiries that we're allowed to determine if somebody is at risk of having COVID-19 and bringing it into the workplace. And while we're taking those temperatures and tracking symptoms, those are medical records of employees that need to be maintained just as any other medical record does. And that is not in their personnel file with sort of their application and yearly performance reviews and anything else that you typically put in a personnel file. That is maintained separately in a medical file for that employee, that is stored and locked and maintained confidentially. And that is required by the ADA and other state and local laws. So you want to make sure that you're doing that. Just to reiterate sort of the safety in the workplace as well, what social distancing means and how you are best going to be able to implement that in your workspace. Are you going to require employees to wear masks? Are you going to be able to reconfigure physical locations so that employees are not working, too closely to each other? Or as Garrett said, are you going to, let people into the kitchen or the break room, or are you going to close it off so that is just not, an option? So those are things that you really want to make sure you think about, that you understand. And I think one final point, the cleaning. Who is actually going to be doing the cleaning? Do you normally have a cleaning company that comes in once a week after hours? That's not going to be enough. So what does that mean? And that's sort of it's a small but very important detail in all this to think about, the cleaning and, educating employees on keeping their own equipment clean and not sharing equipment or using equipment and wiping down bathrooms and doorknobs and all these common touch points and things that we're going to do, and posting signs throughout the workplace as well. So, and then lastly, enforcement. If employees are not going to comply with what's required of social distancing and maintaining good hygiene and cleaning, these are going to be policies and rules that are in place, needing to be mindful of what enforcement of that's going to look like if employees don't comply.
Great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the questions as we've come out. And Randy, by all means, if you, I look forward to tag teaming these questions with you.
Duly noted.
One question from Barbara: if we require employees to wear face coverings, do we need a formal respiratory protection program per OSHA? And so the answer to that question is, if you are required under OSHA standards as an employer for a respirator use, then yes, you must have a respiratory protection program plan in place. Even if let's say that does not apply, as Randy and I alluded to earlier, you still want to train employees on proper use of PPE, even if you're not subject to a specific standard.
I agree with that, right? Proper use, proper disposal, proper handling, etc.
Okay, we have an FFCRA question. Let's see, for emergency FMLA, the poster from Department of Labor says, okay, so I'm gonna paraphrase this question here, which is DOL says one thing on caring for a child and the IRS says another with respect to a child. Have you gotten that question yet, Randy?
I haven't, no, because
Okay.
I usually throw them to you when they come in.
So there is conflicting guidance from the IRS and the Department of Labor on this point. And IRS says that if you're taking FFCRA leave to care for a child who's over 14, there must be special circumstances justifying why you need to care for the child during daylight hours. The DOL does not say that, and the statute doesn't say that. And so what we can tell you at this point is the IRS guidance pertains to the tax credit. So to the extent the IRS is going to require these special circumstances in order to obtain the tax credit, look, that is what the IRS is saying on a website and a Q&A form, which is not binding legal authority at all. We do not recommend that you decline leave for a child that's under 18, even if no special circumstances are shown, because that's not what the statute or the DOL is requiring in those circumstances. Those who work in childcare cannot telework, social distance, and won't be able to keep masks on young children. What are the employer's responsibilities in keeping staff safe? Well, I will tell you, the governor's plan acknowledges that keeping masks on children is difficult. So this is not directly an answer to your question, but there's an acknowledgement that you have to try. You have to make a good faith effort to have your children wear masks when you're out in public. What that looks like in reality is tough. I know my 7-year-old and my 4-year-old would probably not keep a mask on. So that's what the state says. If you're going to reopen, you should, the state says, require your employees to wear masks. And then if it's a child care center, decide whether you're going to try and make kids wear masks or not. The state's not requiring it. And if you have employees who are concerned about working when not 100% of the humans in the workplace are wearing masks, then as we've talked about, engage in a dialogue with that employee. But ultimately, if they're refusing to work, but you are creating a safe workplace, that employee is kind of making his or her own decision and might be out of a job.
And just a couple of additional thoughts on sort of making the workplace as safe as possible, because I agree, especially on the young kids, keeping masks on them is probably like a losing battle, and I don't even know that it's worth it. But requiring that the employees wear the masks, providing as much, hand care and hygiene, opportunities for safe hand washing and using hand sanitizer, cleaning of the toys, being really vigilant about making sure that parents are not bringing kids in who are sick or kids who are coming from a house where there's somebody in the house who is sick, and sort of going, above and beyond and really enforcing that as best as you possibly can without, obviously being able to go into everybody's home and take everyone's temperature. But I think it's absolutely fair to implement a question in sort of the screening of, is anybody in the household exhibiting any symptoms? Is that, and having parents sign off on, or guardians having sign off on that. So really sort of elevating the attempts that you can to keep those who are, willing to show up and work and do the job as child care provider, to keep them as safe as possible.
Absolutely. All right, so we have a WARN Act question, which I'm gonna paraphrase here. It's we were intending to just do a furlough, but that has it appears it's going to morph into something that's longer term. When do we have to provide notice, or are we excused from notice because of COVID-19?
You need to provide notice right away. I think is the answer. So just to sort of jump in, Garrett, I don't know if I was cutting you off.
Oh, that's
there,
fine.
But, okay. I don't do WARN stuff enough every day, so I'm putting the asterisk next to my answer saying that I am paraphrasing, and if there is a particular specific situation, you absolutely, whoever is considering implementing any kind of layoff or closing that might trigger WARN, you absolutely want to consult with counsel on this. This topic came up when COVID first started and furloughs and layoffs were happening. Nobody thought that it would be a 6 month, because there's other exceptions, but 6 months is typically the period of time that you think somebody's going to be laid off, for which your obligation to provide a WARN notice is triggered if you are of a certain size and a certain number of employees at a location are affected. So if all those factors are met, you want to give notice as soon as possible, because the better strategy is giving notice is just giving notice. It doesn't obligate you to close or obligate you to make the layoffs, but it protects you for failing to not give the notice if it turns out in hindsight that you should have. So I think the quick answer is you want to give notice right away. COVID does not excuse you from it. The notice is simply, in fact, that a notice that says it is anticipated that layoffs are going to happen effective this date. And we don't know whether operations will resume, and the notice is given to the affected employees and it's filed with the appropriate governmental agency. And then you can say, okay, I gave notice so that if in fact you were required to, employees can't come back and in addition to suing for whatever else they may put out there, say you also violated WARN because you didn't give us the notice. So that's my sort of long but quick answer to that question. Garrett, I don't know if there's anything else you would add.
No, I thought that was well said, and I would just add, while there might be a chance, and the answer is absolutely not 100% clear, that the pandemic would be provide an excuse for providing notice under the WARN Act. That excuse, to the extent it exists at all, dissipates over time. And so to Randy's point, provide the notice. It's the best practice.
Yeah.
We're getting a lot of questions on written guidelines for telework and returning to work. And if you join late, I'll just remind you, email Randy, email me, email another attorney at Coleman and Sarsier. We're happy to share these guidelines, this checklist with you, and then even consult with you about making it appropriate for your workplace. So to those of you who asked that question, yes, shoot us an email. Happy to share this information with you.
Were they specific questions about the guidelines in general or teleworking as a particular component?
Both.
Okay. So, and yeah, so I think the same answer applies, but I'll just throw out a couple of thoughts on teleworking. If you don't have a policy or haven't sort of put one together in the last 4 to 6 weeks, or at least a default practice given COVID, you absolutely want to put one in place. You may now see that teleworking is feasible for certain positions. Again, you don't have to give teleworking to all positions. It does not mean that if you give it to some, you have to give it to everybody, but you obviously don't want to be discriminatory or otherwise inconsistent in the way you make the decisions. And one way to make sure that doesn't happen is that you have a teleworking policy in place that fits your industry, your company's needs. Identifying when teleworking may be feasible, how it works, what the requirements are in order for an employee, whether it's the nature of the position and then the employee, him or herself, being in good standing and, being at the company for a certain period of time. I mean, there's all sorts of components of a teleworking policy and a teleworking agreement that would, in theory, go in conjunction with that. As well as restrictions on how long it may last and modifications and equipment. I mean, that could be its own sort of presentation. So you would want to absolutely consult with counsel on that if you don't have something in place to figure out and identify the best way to put that into place.
Next question is, if I ask an employee to return, okay, I'm going to paraphrase it again. So we have an employee and the employer can now reopen and wants the employee to return to work, but the employee refuses because they can make more money from unemployment. What do I do? And so if you have work for an employee and they refuse to take it, they're going to be ineligible for unemployment. So even under this circumstance,
right.
And in fact, that's in the updated FAQs from the state unemployment as well. And we can expect to hear this question a lot more, and we've been hearing it up to this point. So as soon as that employee refuses to return to work, maybe you explain to them, look, we're going to replace you. We're got to fill the position. We have work available, and then hire a new individual. And that will help you, especially if you received a PPP loan, for example, and you have to restore your headcount by June 30th. You may proceed, but you want to document, as Randy mentioned with some other topics earlier, these decisions so that you can support the actions you've taken if you get into a litigation or a discrimination charge posture.
And Garrett, I'm just going to piggyback on that and sort of, it's not the specific question asked, but I know it's a question that I'm expecting is probably in your list of questions, or one that I know we both have dealt with clients, is What if I have an employee who doesn't want to come back to work just because they have that sort of generalized fear of coming into the workplace because they don't want to be additionally exposed to COVID-19? And I'm talking about the person doesn't have an underlying health condition. They're not high risk because of pregnancy or age or some autoimmune condition, or they don't even have somebody in their house who is high risk. This is just somebody who may have generalized fear and anxiety. What does the employer do then when we say, okay, we're ready for you to come back to work, and they say, but I don't wanna because I'm scared. So how do we, again, there isn't a one size fits all answer, and you do need to, sort of approach not with a, okay, well, that's it, you're gone. You're going to want to still have the opportunity to have a dialogue with the employee, find out why, and give them and document that you've done this, give them a meaningful opportunity to explain their fear. In exchange, you as the employer are going to give the employee all the information that we've been talking about and that you're putting in your plan and what you're doing to keep the workplace safe. How, either there's going to be less people in, we're going to, stagger people, we're going to have schedules staggered, we're going to be doing social distancing, we're going to have hygiene stations, and sort of all the things that you are going to be in fact requiring of employees to keep them safe. There might be an opportunity to relocate this person's physical workspace. If they're normally in a high traffic area, maybe they can be temporarily relocated to a less trafficked area that might make them feel a sense of sort of less people around, less opportunity for sort of contamination. So you want to have that conversation, give the employee that information. Maybe you give the employee some period of leave to kind of get his or herself maybe more comfortable with the idea. It doesn't have to be extended, it doesn't have to be long, and there may be some exceptions to that, but I think the message is don't automatically just cut them off and terminate and say, forget it, if you're not coming back, you're done. At least engage in discussion and dialogue, see if you might be able to get that person more comfortable with returning. And then even after those efforts have been exhausted and maybe there's been a modest period of leave, and the employee is still not willing to come back, then maybe that might be time to implement a termination decision, but at least you have gone through some steps. And again, there's caveats to that, but I just wanted to address that, Garrett. I don't know if you have any different or additional thoughts to that.
No, I think, again, that was well said, and I wholeheartedly agree. So Randy, we're approaching 12 o'clock. We haven't gotten to every question, but we have gotten to most of them. So what I would say is, if we didn't get to your question today, shoot us an email, give me a call. We're happy to talk through you with this, because again, an ounce of prevention. I mean, this is so important right now. We can get it right. We can talk through these things and assess risk and then make the right decision. So with that, Randy, did you have any closing thoughts you wanted to add?
No, I just, I appreciate you all being willing to listen. Again, I mean, planning, being flexible, being creative, being responsive, and documenting, those and communicative. I mean, just, what would you want to hear from your employer if this were you? And you all are still part of your employer. What information would you want? And just let that be your guiding post. And we're here as we can be to help along the way as well.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Good luck.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.